Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Scouting for Growth, where we will dive into the world of legal. In the fast-paced world of startups, legal considerations are often seen as a roadblock rather than a launchpad. But our guest today is here to challenge and change that perception. With over 20 years of legal experience and a passion for empowering high-growth technology companies, Nick Pester is a true trailblazer in the startup ecosystem. And you will see he has been working with some interesting ventures, which I'm not going to disclose right now. As a founder of Beyond Legal, Nick is on a mission to revolutionize the way startups access legal support. His unique approach combines the strategic insight of an in-house counsel with the flexibility and affordability of fractional services. But Nick's impact goes far beyond just providing legal advice. Throughout his career, Nick has been a trusted mentor and advisor to countless early-stage businesses, from navigating the challenges of international expansion to securing major funding rounds. He has been in the trenches with founders, helping them scale their ventures to new heights. I met Nick many years back when I was running Startup Bootcamp InsurTech, and Nick actually was here to help the startup founders on my program too. But what really sets Nick apart is his ability to see legal as a growth enabler. He understands that getting the right legal foundation in place from the outset can make all the differences when it comes to attracting investors and achieving long-term success. So whether you are a founder looking to take your startup to the next level or an investor seeking to mitigate risk in your portfolio, this episode is for you. Get ready to discover how legal can be a powerful ally in your growth journey as we dive into the mind of one of the industry's most innovative thinkers. Without further ado, let's welcome Nick Pester to Scouting for Growth. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for joining me on Scouting for Growth.
Hey, Sabine. How you doing? Good to see you.
I'm good. Well, I would say long time no see or long time no speak, but it's not true because we saw each other at InsurTech Insights just a few months ago, and it was superb to actually see you there and actually learn about your reinvented path, Nick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was lovely to see you, and it's funny because obviously we went through a period of a couple of years where I was, I guess, kind of on the outskirts more of the InsurTech scene. But since seeing you recently, obviously we've caught up quite a lot, so it's good to kind of get back into that regular contact, and hopefully we continue to chat.
Yeah. Well, let's start with some introduction about who you are and where you come from, because I know in our ecosystem, some people know you very well because of where you've been, but let's get everybody listening to Scouting for Growth to really understand who is Nick Pester.
Well, that's a big question. Let's just focus on that. Let's focus on the experience, I guess, first, the professional side. So my foundations were built in a traditional city insurance practice for a long time, a firm called RPC. And when I left RPC to join Capital Law, who I'm sure some of the listeners will have heard of before, InsurTech was kind of like this nascent thing that was just developing. Of course, it was at the time that you were out there trailblazing in the InsurTech sector. And it was just something that really grabbed my attention because I'm a massive fan of innovation, hugely passionate about entrepreneurship. And I had seen some of these kind of, I guess, historical legacy issues within the market that these guys were trying to address. So it just really kind of captured my imagination. And the idea at Capital was to build out what was probably the UK's first InsurTech specific practice, which was working with InsurTech companies across the whole range of their needs. Because what we had seen was obviously very good insurance firms not necessarily getting the startup side of things, or vice versa. The startup side maybe not getting the kind of intricacies of the insurance. So we just wanted to join up the dots. So had a great time there building that team out for 2.5 years, met lots of wonderful people, including yourself, of course. And then really wanted to kind of sate my in-house appetite and kind of go on the inside and work with some of these guys more at the coal face, which is when I joined Zego as their first general counsel, who again, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will have heard of. No legal teams as such to talk of at the time that I joined. And it was a pretty crazy period there where we grew from 80 to 600 employees and had our Series C fundraise where Zego hit its unicorn status. And we had Brexit and lots of other interesting stroke headachy legal things to deal with, which was a fantastic experience. And then after a kind of brief time out of the insurtech scene, working for a company called Wheelie, again as general counsel, where I kind of, I guess, was much more involved in the corporate stroke leadership and strategic side of the business, as opposed to just the hard law and regulatory side. I decided that I missed insurtech and really missed people like yourself, and really wanted to come back to working with lots of different people and lots of different companies, but in a way that enabled me not to be so kind of hamstrung or restricted in terms of the different things that I could do, and meaning that I can offer the client something that was a lot more flexible and a lot more adaptable. So that's a whirlwind tour, I guess, of how I've kind of come to where I am now and what I'm looking to hopefully deliver to the market.
Hey, folks, do you want exclusive bonus content for free? And at the same time, have your voice heard about the future of this podcast, including content ideas and future guests? If so, then please complete the survey. It is the top link in the show notes. I would love to hear your views on the show and how we can improve it. And to say thank you, you will get access to exclusive content and 15% off all of our upcoming programs. That's superb, though. So let's just start with what is required for building a strong legal foundation. Because we talk about insurance technology, we talk about startup, we talked about scale-ups, right? You've worked with a number of scale-ups as well. So really understanding the challenge from within. So what are the common pitfall legal challenges you see in early stage scale-up startups, and the things they make, and how can founders avoid them, Nick?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think actually this you can talk about this also in the context of how the market has changed over the last few years, because we spoke recently about how you balance that needs of competitive advantage and moving quickly and first mover advantage, which of course is super important and which I've always tried to support with the businesses that I work with, but against the hard realities, obviously, of doing something wrong or making sure that actually you're not being unnecessarily exposed and that you're keeping yourself in a structure and in a way that is attractive to investors, for example. And I think if you compare 2021, where capital was a lot more freely available, where people could perhaps be a little bit more fast and loose in terms of how they did things, to where we are now, where obviously capital has dried up somewhat, and actually VCs are tending, not always, but tending to focus on existing portfolios primarily. I think that need to be a little bit tighter and be a little bit more organized in terms of your structure, and particularly things like your corporate admin, like the health of your constitutional documents, if you want to call it that, I think has become much more important. And I think that one of the things I always felt when I worked with startups is that there was always a tendency to chase the shiny ball. And this is not just from a legal perspective, but as a more kind of generic point, that it's very easy to get distracted by lots of different strands or kind of offshoots or spin-offs that you could do. And I think the businesses that you see succeed in the longer term are those that have that patience and dedication and kind of control, really, to just say, these are the things we're going after. This is what we're going to focus on for the next 12 months, and not be scattergun about it. And I think you tend to see those businesses also reflected internally, having a more organized structure and a more organized kind of way of doing things. So it's that balance between being quick, being efficient, being for having that first mover advantage, but also making sure that you're all joined up correctly, like internally as well.
Yeah. And so in your viewpoint? How can, therefore, startup leverage legal counsel? Remember, when I was at Startup Bootcamp, the first person actually I recruited before the program started was a legal counsel.
Yeah, I remember very well.
Right. Yeah. Still good, an amazing friend of mine. She has a beautiful little baby girl at the minute. And so, yes, those are the people in your life who actually you keep in touch with as well. But how do you use, therefore, legal counsel to grow your business, right? As a growth enabler to help you make better choices around being investment ready and attract VC funding?
I think that there is an element there which is just to do with the mindset towards the legal function and how legal function is to be employed within the business, and actually the use of external legal counsel as well. I think that, and not unfairly, I understand sometimes where the perception comes from, but that founders and business have a tendency to view lawyers as being the kind of either the naysayers, to be honest, the ones who are going to say, no, you can't do this, or the kind of box tickers at the end of the exercise, like, have we done this correctly? And I think people really underestimate the value of a good commercial lawyer. And I mean, the best lawyers I've ever worked with in my career are the ones who you kind of take it as a given that they know the legal side, that their technical knowledge is good. But actually, what you really get from them is not just that technical nous, or actually less so the technical nous. It's that ability to see what the business is trying to achieve and to marry that legal requirement with, more importantly, what the business has as its commercial objectives. And actually getting those types of people involved at the outset, even if it's just a sense check, even if it is literally just to sit down and talk things through, is so valuable. And I think that there is this tendency maybe to not appreciate necessarily the amount of value that kind of commercial lawyer can bring to the conversation. And it is very much it's a two-way thing. The legal market hasn't in the past sometimes done itself any favors in terms of the way it's approached its side of the equation. But equally, I think some clients have been kind of naturally skeptical of how legal can be involved. And I would say empower them. If you've got a good commercial lawyer in your team or who you work with, empower them, give them the chance to lead on things. And actually you will see the value that they can bring beyond just the legal side of things.
I so much agree. For me, the best lawyer I work with is about marrying legal regulation with commerciality. And so being able to really understand the contract, the relationship, and then, identifying the clauses which need to be in the contract, which are the most relevant clause to protect the business, to protect the client and the partner as well. But it's not about having rubbish also in the contract just for the sake of having clauses which do not mean anything. And I remember, even at Startup Bootcamp, we work with our legal counsel internally, but we would also involve external legal counsels sometimes on major deals. And the best one I work with would say, well, why do we need that clause? What is the value of that clause? And then when you start unpacking, the clause said, well, no, it's not actually providing any value to this contract. So let's just take it out. And that was actually quite relieving, quite empowering to actually feel like you're really caring for your clients, your partners, but then you really understand what the clause is about and what the law is about. It's about protecting, but it's also about providing some level of trust as well, I guess.
Yeah. I think the point that I'm picking up on there is that collaboration point. We need to get away from this mindset that the two opposing parties to a contract are adversaries in some way, right? It's a partnership, it's a collaboration. And the best lawyers are the ones who recognize that horse trade is sometimes not just, well, you give us A and we give you B. It's actually figuring out where the value lies for each individual party and marrying them together in a way which is fair and also respectful of, either party's interests. And I think I unfortunately have dealt with many contracts in the past, I'm sure you have, where exactly as you say, Sabine, you end up with this 35 page document, which doesn't really add any value at all. And the absolute bane of my existence is the standard T's and C's argument that people roll out far too often, where it's kind of almost this knee-jerk reactive position of, these are our standard terms, we can't change them. And to me, that's lazy lawyering. That's not actually really applying your mind to whether that is actually genuinely the case. And also within the context of how important that partnership is, because if that partnership is incredibly important to the business, Your job as a lawyer is to make it as streamlined and succinct as possible, whilst also, of course, flagging any risk to the business internally. But it's not your job to make a decision on whether you proceed with that document or not. And I think that's sometimes where lawyers blur the line, shall we say, between the two.
Yeah. So, we have gone through some interesting times. We've had pandemic, and then 2023 was a year of, I think, reevaluation for many. And partly when you start looking at investment, as we know, investment numbers have crashed, from 1.2, I guess, trillion dollar investment in 2022. Numbers was probably half trillion last year, right? And so therefore, when you look at scale-up startups looking for investment, but also legal advice, it means that they may not always seek the best advice because there's a budget for it. So what advice do you have for founders when it comes to negotiating, structuring contracts, and making choices on legal advice in times of uncertainty, partly when lawyers charge you by the minute, right? By the hour, and actually do not keep the clock.
I mean, that's a whole different part of a podcast we could do there on the billable hour, Sabine. But let's not get. I won't go down that rabbit hole. You'll never pull me back out again. But let me. I'll deal with it because both are very fair points. And I think they're slightly different. So on the one hand, you've got contracts more generally. On the other, you've got your choice of legal advisors. And I think with contracts more generally, we've touched on some of the points, which is to be reasonable, to have the right tone, to be mutually respectful of each party's obligations, to try and use your own templates where you can, because actually one of the pains that you'll have as an early stage business is having 15 different variations of essentially the same contract in place, because you end up really losing track of how things may fluctuate between different partners. But I think also in terms of the legal advisor, to be honest, for me, it's more to do with actually what they do rather than what they say, right? And to me, it's every lawyer in the world, if you give them the chance, will say, we have a commercial approach to our relationships. We always take things in, with a pinch of salt. We always look at the longer term partnership, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, when it really comes down to it, don't necessarily always live up to that promise. So I think me as a founder or me as an early stage business owner, I would be kind of putting them to the test. I think there are don't get me wrong, there are plenty of good legal advisors out there who will give you that extra bit of time for free, who won't count every minute, who will actually provide you with insights beyond the purely kind of technical and legal. And you need to just, I guess, test them early, test them early on in the relationship, see whether they're happy to give up half an hour of their time for free, because it's the ones that actually you'll set that tone very early on, and actually you'll get the warning signs quite quickly. So I think look for good advice early on, but and actually it's the individual lawyer primarily rather than the firm. That's one other thing I would say as a general rule. Don't get too wrapped up in the name of the firm. Find the individual that works for you, not just go on kind of simple recommendations by name.
Yeah. Important, right, to evaluate the relationship, whether they are going to run the extra mile. And sometimes, as you said, the advice can be really simple, but at the end of the day, it's about building relationship. Yeah. One thing which comes often when I talk to startup and scale-ups, actually, Nick, is the question around protecting intellectual property and data. Yeah. And remember, when we built Startup Bootcamp in Europe and then moved to the US, I was actually not surprised, but, I realized how important IP is so, critical in the United States. And even startups coming from the UK wanting to go to the US, they have to make sure they are trademark ready, IP ready, because over there, if there is a little bit of a problem, well, you cannot transact, you cannot be commercially sustainable. So what would be your advice to those startups and scale-ups? How should they approach intellectual property protection, such as patents, trademarks, copyrights? I'm sure there are other things we should be considering, but at least the three.
Yeah, I think that it would form part of, I guess, the starter pack in terms of what founders should be considering from a legal point of view. I mean, obviously, you have your incorporation documents, which will be dealt with at the time that you set the company up. But at the same time, you should be giving some thought to location, jurisdiction over time, like whether you will actually plan to expand into other markets in the longer run. Because not to kind of get sidetracked, but one of the things you do often see is kind of some of the difficulties involved with when you swap jurisdictions of holding company, for example, later on down the line, which might end up being quite a complicated exercise to perform and involve close management of existing shareholders and et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of different parts of this startup pack, I would say, and one of them is definitely IP. And you're right, there are a lot of, and it's fair because obviously people, founders are natural entrepreneurs who have an idea and want to run with it, and it might not be necessarily within their nature to sort of say, well, actually, what do I need to do to protect this before I end up going, half a mile down the road? And I think IP is one of those things as well, where perhaps people don't appreciate that there are some very simple things that you can do straight off the bat, which are not expensive. In fact, they're pretty much negligible in terms of the cost involved, but which just gives you that very basic protection to start with. And one of the benefits with trademarks in particular is that, of course, there are variations between different jurisdictions in terms of how the rules work, but actually the classes of trademarks and the way that class registration works is very similar in all of the different internationally, really, across the world. So there is this notion of having a priority date, for example. And if you have that priority date in one jurisdiction, you can essentially backdate it to pretty much any other jurisdiction later on down the line. If you have somebody that might be challenging it or launching a similar service in a different country, for example. So there's that starting point, which is really, where am I registering? What is the basic premise of what I'm doing? What is the logo? What is the name? Let's just get that registered across however many classes. And by classes, just to explain a bit more for the listeners, it's the particular goods or services that you are providing. So obviously in the case of InsurTech, it'll be predominantly insurance focused, but get that registration done early, and then take it from there, really. And like I say, because you've got that backdating protection, very often that is not a bad place to start from, and then just to see where things go after that. But yeah, I think, as I say, maybe some businesses don't necessarily understand that it's quite a straightforward thing to do from the start, and it isn't expensive at all.
Yeah, no, that's helpful to know, actually, because now you find more and more a platform which allows you to register in multiple countries as well, which was not as easy once upon a time. And some of those lawyers also, they do their own research, and in 5 minutes they tell you which classes your business is in. So that is superb. And I guess this is the power of digitalization. On the data front, when we think about, data privacy, security regulation, we've seen GDPR, but we have now the EU AI Act. What we need to consider when building product and services?
So the data side is very interesting because, and not to get ahead, because I know that we plan to touch on some of the AI regulations later in the podcast, but I think with data protection and the way that will now play into AI and the way that AI is evolving, this whole concept of privacy by design, which was always a thing under the GDPR, is going to be really sort of front and center in terms of when companies are developing new products and thinking about the way their data flows operate. So having that very much at the front, very much kind of a priority in terms of the mindset. How are we going to deal with vulnerable customers, for example? How are we going to ensure that there's no bias in terms of how people are profiled or priced, or how their data is processed, etc. And actually, the ICO, the UK is taking more of a kind of building on existing framework approach, which we can elaborate on later. But the ICO, I think, is going to be the Information Commissioner's Office, who is the data protection regulator within the UK, is going to play a huge role in terms of the evolution of AI regulation. And I think getting them on board early on by being very well organized and very thorough as far as privacy by design is concerned is going to be important. The other thing I would say, Sabine, as well, is engage with the regulators. I've spoken to a couple of clients recently, actually the FCA in this case rather than the ICO, who've had some really good constructive conversations with the FCA. And I think that there's a kind of tendency to think it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and actually the FCA are going to be really harsh, or they're actually really not. They are as kind of positive and determined to encourage innovation within the UK as anybody else is, right? They just need to do their job at the same time. So if that means telling people in advance so they don't have to deal with an issue down the road, then that's in everybody's interest, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, as you know, I was once upon a time a regulator. And so when we were doing startup bootcamp, if you remember well, the regulator used to come to see the startups and provide not, they would not provide advice, but they would actually provide presentation around, how to protect customer, what is good conduct. They would answer regulatory related questions
Yep.
and also provide documentation to those organizations and those young founders to really understand what that means to be customer centric.
Yep. Yep.
I would like to go international, right? You have been at Zego, you've managed growth and expansion across markets. And I think a lot of our listeners are, always investigating, okay, I grew up my business here, now I want to move overseas. So what are the legal considerations I should consider as a startup, as a scale up? What are the things I should keep in mind when I want to expand to new market and to new environments and launch new product and services? How do I mitigate risk, Nick?
It's this is a really good example, I think, of where what we were touching on earlier around the difference between the kind of hard legal knowledge and the way that a good commercial lawyer can really drive a project or drive the launch of a new product or a new country, etc. A lot of companies will look very much superficially at what are the rules, what are the hard rules in terms of what can we do in this country compared to what can we do in that country. If we're looking at, for example, what is a regulated activity, obviously that will vary between different jurisdictions. Or what are the rules around intermediary activity in this country? How much more, we obviously have rules in the UK around introductions, which might differ in other jurisdictions. So there's a tendency to kind of focus on what you would call the hard facts of launching in a new country, for example. But actually, very often, the real reason, as far as I'm concerned, to prioritize or to choose a particular jurisdiction is actually more around the mindset of the regulator. What is the speed that they act with? What is their view towards innovation? What's their view towards digital business? There is a big difference between for example, the Bank of Ireland have a much more traditional, I would say, archaic approach to how regulation is dealt with and applications are processed than maybe the AFM in Netherlands would have, for example, right? So there is very different approaches within different markets to how things are handled. So don't miss that. I think that, and this is again is where a good commercial lawyer comes in handy, is being able to look beyond, see the wood through the trees, I guess is the expression, and actually understand the holistic picture, not just what the hard rules are. And I think just to reiterate the point we were just talking about, privacy by design and AI regulations and the way that that's likely to evolve in different jurisdictions. The EU has obviously taken a bit more of a, not prescriptive, but a bit more of a structured approach through the AI bill, but the UK is much more kind of the existing framework. So again, that you will see there'll be some harmonization, but you'll also, I'm sure, see some kind of parting of the ways in terms of how different countries will deal with these things. So do your research properly. Don't just look at the hard legal facts, but look at the kind of surrounding commercial environment as well.
And so, you were part of a well-known scale-up, and I assume, you went through a number of founding rounds and capital raise, from seed to Series A and beyond. So what were for you some of the common legal challenges? Because this scale-up went across Europe, and so you had to look at a lot of different countries' legal frameworks.
Mm-hmm. I think, again, to go back to the point around the way the markets have evolved, I think that there are different considerations now to what there were 3 years ago. I think 3 years ago, where a lot of things went wrong is that the capital was so freely available that it almost created a bit of a kind of, there was a frothing effect, right? You had a lot of FOMO involved in the market and VCs kind of outbidding each other to get involved in what they saw as being the poster child at that time of the sector, but actually maybe not kind of digging deep enough. For example, with DD, which of course now we're in a completely different environment. DD tends to be more enhanced than certainly more enhanced than it was 3 years ago, for example. But I think the other thing I would highlight specifically is fund specific terms. One thing I have seen, certainly more recently as well, is obviously terms are becoming more onerous in terms of more pro investor rather than pro company. Particularly the case with things like convertible instruments, CLAs, and advanced subscription agreements. They tend to have harsher interest rates or harsher rules around repayment, etc., because that's just the way that the market is at the moment. But the cautionary note I would kind of add here is there is a balance again between, of course, you need the capital. I appreciate lots of businesses are in a situation where they don't really have a choice, and that's fine. You have to obviously make the best of what you can in that situation, but don't be too quick to grant very nuanced niche investor specific terms, because the difficulties of unpicking that later down the line, you don't know, in a year or 2 years time, you may get this, things may go absolutely incredibly well, and you get this huge big ticket cornerstone investor that wants to come on board, and they're totally put off by the fact you've got this very unusual or onerous term kind of in the term sheet. I mean, I've seen constitutional documents, incorporation documents before, which have literally individual investor rights, which ensure that nothing can be changed with respect to their rights and their voting rights and everything else without their specific, forget the usual consent thresholds under the Companies Act and under what would be standard articles. Literally their specific consent is required to do anything. Now that is obviously a very difficult position to unpick yourself from. So just don't be too quick to run into things. Sometimes things are too good to be true. That sometimes that truism is actually the case. So just be a little bit wary if something looks like a great deal on the surface. Make sure you're doing the company's own due diligence on the investor and checking that the terms actually going to work for you in the longer run.
Let's talk also about people and hiring, because right now, as you know, we have a talent gap. And so a lot of companies are either trying to find the right talent or find the more mature talent, able to get specific job done fast, and easier. And so what for you would be, for instance, the right time to set up a share option schemes, when you start looking at people from a legal risk viewpoint? What would be your advice to the organization which are out there trying to do the right things for their employees?
I think share options is definitely one of those areas where, and to be fair, most companies I've worked with would tend to do this anyway. It's something that you address right at the very outset. Particularly, I mean, if obviously your plan is just to carry on with 2 or 3 people for forevermore, not so much of an issue. But obviously, if your plan is, like most founders, to grow the business and scale it, then you need to address it right at the beginning. I mean, obviously, that's partly dependent on the size of the company, because things will change from an EMI scheme into a CSOP or ESOP scheme, for example, depending on how big the company becomes. But I think understanding 2 things. I think understanding how you want to use them with non-employees, because there are very different, particularly around tax, there are very different rules for employees versus non-employees. Obviously, generally much more beneficial for an employee, but also the particular type of option or share scheme that you want to use. Because again, I've seen people run into or kind of jump at things like growth shares without really necessarily understanding exactly what they achieve and what really the scenario is, what's the best scenario in which to deploy them, right? So, and I've also worked with businesses who have to play catch up after the fact, who have kind of had this idea of what they want to do the whole way through, but they haven't actually formalized anything until maybe a year down the line. And at that point, particularly with a tax approved scheme, it becomes very difficult to backdate and to retrospectively untangle things. So get it done early. Do take specialist advice. I would say if there's one area of due diligence that investors always, without fail, really get stuck into, it's around share option schemes, and particularly the way that it's been used with advisors and consultants and contractors and that type of thing. That is always a big area of focus. So get it done right early on, and just accept the fact it is one of those areas where you probably will spend a bit of cost, but in the longer run, it's going to save you a lot of pain, is my experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you start highlighting investors and potentially their dislike of having consultants and external parties on, I guess, a cap table or having share options. But often it's because the founders cannot afford the services. And so they have this trade-off where they actually preferring to provide share options or even equity in some respects to actually pay for the service, often growth-related service of those people.
100%. Yeah. So don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way discouraging their use. I'm just saying make sure that you're getting proper advice when you're implementing them, because I think there is a tendency sometimes to see them as kind of the magic beans that can be thrown out to everybody and doesn't really matter. You know, we can continue to buy people with sweat equity, etc.
Yeah.
But of course, there are repercussions for that, and you have to consider it in terms of the longer term health of the company, how investors are going to view it. So, not in any way am I saying don't do it. It's absolutely a vital part of the startup economy in the way that the capital markets work within the startup space. But just be cautious in terms of things like the strike price you're granting, the kind of the number of shares and the milestones you're tying it to, the growth hurdles you're tying it to, etc. Just make sure you get good advice on that from the beginning, because what you don't want to do is kind of hand it out like you know, monopoly money, and then sort of realize 2 years down the line that you've given away half of the company, right? So you just need to be careful about it. That's all.
Yeah, you need to do it the right way. So let's navigate, you know, the evolving world of trends and regulations. So first, I want to ask you, what is your top hot topic or hot trend you're following right now, Nick? What is keeping you fun at night?
AI. It's always AI. I've found AI fascinating from particularly within financial services from my first few days at Capital Law, because it's such a difficult it's kind of like herding cats, I think, from a regulator's point of view. It's such a difficult thing to put a pin in terms of where is it even going to be in a month, let alone where is it going to be in a year? You know, the speed at which these things are evolving is absolutely incredible. And, you know, I'm sure you've heard the same stories as I have around law firms having to tell, for example, some of the juniors not to use things like chat GPT to prepare templates, because that's just the world we're living in now, where people have this tendency to do this. And of course, founders are going to be the same, right? They're obviously going to use these types of functions. But within the space of a regulated activity, and particularly things which are advisory, and the thing I've always found fascinating is explainability, because of course one of the key concepts as far as the regulators are concerned is, can you stand behind that decision and tell us how you've got there, right? Particularly from the point of view of GDPR and the right not to be subject to automated processing and have a human involved. Well, at what point do we get to the stage where actually people are genuinely scratching their heads and saying, I've got no idea like where that's come from. No idea. You know, we can give it a best guess because we've obviously done a lot of work around the programming and taken into account things like algorithmic bias and etc. But how can, you know, what stage does it become genuinely a free thinking entity almost, where you genuinely cannot really say how it's reached the final outcome? And I find it fascinating, and I think that looking at how regulators are trying to grapple with that at the moment has been probably the thing that I followed most closely recently.
Yes. Are you using AI? I mean, I'm sure you have read some of these AI issues with legal advice counsel, or people, lawyers going to court and getting ChatGPT to do their jobs.
Yes.
What's your view? And do you use a little bit of AI?
Well, certainly not for any of the advice I've drafted, Sabine, just to be clear about that. But no, look, I mean, it's a really fair question. And I'm absolutely one of those lawyers that does not see any point trying to fight the tide, right? I think that law firms who bury their heads in the sand and kind of live under this pretense that things will just carry on as it always is, and people are still going to pay hundreds, if not thousands of pounds for a very stock thing, it's delusional. Frankly, it's just not going to carry on like that. So my viewpoint on this is, over time, what I would envisage building into our offering is actually a platform where people can use AI at the front end to produce the very basic stuff themselves. And if they want a lawyer just to spend 30 minutes or 1 hour just having a look over it to make sure there's nothing absolutely horrific in there in terms of exposures, no problem at all. And that's the way that it should work. And I think if lawyers want to preserve their positions as trusted advisors, the way that, with how AI is impacting all professions, then they need to become trusted advisors, which is not just somebody who kind of produces the very black and white technical kind of draft things. It's somebody who actually gives people that holistic, really nuanced, colored advice. Like, so it's actually a trend that lawyers need to embrace, as far as I'm concerned. Although I wouldn't go so far as maybe the lawyers involved in the court case that you just mentioned. That's probably taking it one step too far.
In those cases, because of hallucination, the cases which were listed didn't exist. And so then the judge didn't know how to deal with this. So it was an interesting situation when you think about it. And so for sure, we need to embrace the tides. We need to leverage artificial intelligence. Are you considering to have a chat GPT AI, just customized for you? Because every day I'm being approached nowadays by agency wanted to build a chat GPT or an LLM just for me. What's your view?
Well, if you can get me a good referral rate, Sabine, I'd definitely consider it. But no, I mean, of course, I would 100%. Again, like I said, I've always approached my career in a totally open-minded way. Like not quite like the Yes Man. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that film, but this kind of notion of just saying yes to everything. But just being open-minded, right? Just kind of allowing other people's perspectives, thoughts, suggestions to infiltrate, because I ultimately, this is the way the profession is going. And if actually you can harness that to reduce something which is actually distinctive as far as you are concerned, and really sits very neatly within your overall offering, then yeah, 100%. I would see no reason not to do that. But I think you need to, any law firm that proposes to do this needs to get themselves set up internally in the right way first, because at the moment, I think the real risk is you end up kind of, like turkeys voting for Christmas. You end up just replacing yourself if you haven't got a thought beyond what that means for you as a profession and as a firm. That has to be the starting point. And I think you do see law firms generally starting to get to grips with that, but there are many that frankly haven't even really kind of countenanced the idea yet. So I think it's going to be a kind of evolutionary process over the next sort of 6 to 12 months. I think you've seen that, survival of the fittest, as it were.
I guess when I think about some of the lawyers from big firms I've met in recent months, some are really scared, and others have been kind of honest, saying, we need to embrace it. And then when I ask, where do you think your job as a legal professional is going to go? I said, well, some of them is, we need to focus on helping our client make better decisions. We need to help our clients being more creative, probably the commercial acumen you just mentioned around this not black and white. The one which I thought was the most interesting is we need to be better at negotiating. So the role of the lawyer is then moving to becoming a negotiator rather than just the pure white and black regulatory analysis, but also clause building in the contract, which I thought was interesting. When you look at actually artificial intelligence and, some of the rules we are seeing now in the EU, in the United Kingdom, the Biden as well directives. How do you think fintech and insurtech can get to grip with all those changes?
I think the first thing to say, certainly from a UK perspective, is that there's not been any kind of wholesale rewrites suggested so far. The FCA has always been very much an outcomes-based regulator. It's always been the way that it's approached, as you will well know, as it's always been the way it's approached things, and it hasn't changed with AI. And to some extent, I think that's absolutely right, because the point I just made earlier, things are changing so quickly that if you draft one thing, then very, very quickly is out of date. And actually, it's interesting to think about in the context of the AI Act in the EU. If you look at how quickly, for example, GDPR was in need of update and amendment, it gives you a good indication of actually how quickly like a piece of legislation can become outdated. So I actually think that the FCA's approach thus far has been, it looks to be the right one. And I think the UK government's decision to make it sector led and to be led by the individual regulators within each vertical is actually the right thing to do. Having said that, there is, of course, closer cooperation now between the CMA and the ICO and the FCA via those. They've actually set up a body called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. A little bit of a mouthful, but anyway, that's what they've called it. So these guys have been they've been ordained to work together, and I think obviously that's what they need to do. What is interesting from what I have read from the FCA is that explainability does still seem to be like the problem child, right, for both. And actually, the EU have refer to this within their rationale for having a formal piece of legislation is concerns around explainability and how that obviously filters into fairness, etc. So I think the one area to focus on, to be really kind of conscious of as a fintech, is that point around explainability. Because if you look at other things like accountability or fairness or whatever, it's kind of covered to a large extent by what we already have around principles for business and the senior managers regime and all of these good things that the FCA has already introduced. We've kind of got a framework to a large extent for it, but explainability to me is really the interesting area. And I'll be honest, I kind of thought it was a bit of a cop out, like what the FCA said on explainability. There wasn't a lot in there if you look at their AI update. And I think it's genuinely because it still requires a lot more thought. I'm not necessarily being critical. I think it's an area that really requires thought. So as a technology business, if you can be really clear and button down from the start what the rationale is for the system, how it reaches the decisions it does, have good human oversight governance processes in place, I think that you're going to be probably quite a long way ahead of the game, because that I think is going to be one of the real challenges from a regulatory point of view down the line.
So let's go into beyond legal. I like the name because it sounds like we are going to do more than legal. And so tell us a little bit more how you're helping those growth ventures who are there, achieve robust legal framework protection within their business. How are you helping them every day? From, time resourcing viewpoint, legal viewpoint, how are you transforming the world? Now you're back.
I think it starts first of all with perception and mindset, to go back to the conversation we had earlier on. I understand why there have been certain perceptions in the past of the way that the legal market may work and some of the things they may not do particularly well. And I recognize that, having been on both sides of the fence for the last 15, 20 years, both, private practice and general counsel. I know where those pain points exist. And I'm trying to kind of encourage people to see that actually legal is a real growth enabler. It really is. If you've got a good commercial lawyer involved with not all parts of your business, but with the really critical elements, it's a huge growth enabler. But I think the secondary part of that, of course, is that rightly, people will often consider it cost prohibitive. So they will look at what they've spent on firms in the past and think, do you know what? If there's a choice between spending 2,000 on this or actually just kind of winging it a little bit and seeing how we get on, we're obviously going to go with the latter, right? And what I'm trying to do is say that you don't have to compromise on these things. You don't have to spend hundreds or thousands of pounds up front. You can just dip in and out. You can just sense check things when you need to. So the general idea is to kind of work with them on more of an in-house basis. So integrated within the commercial side of the business as well, but with none of the kind of commitments that go with obviously hiring somebody full time, and obviously on a much more cost effective basis. And I think it's working well. I think people have kind of resonated to the idea, and I think that companies that I'm working with on more of a subscription model basis, which is certain number of hours a month, their view tends to be to include me on the Slack channel, for example, or to include me on the email loops, to really make me a part of the business, because that's where you will derive the greatest value. So I'm hoping that I think the market is ready for it, a different, just an alternative, a different kind of proposition. And I strongly believe that the fractional market is the way that will be a big part of the future in terms of the way the legal sector operates.
So where can people, founders, find you? How do they get in touch with you, Nick?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, as you know, Sabine. So I would suggest that just drop me an invitation to connect. I do not bite, as opposed to some lawyers. I'm very friendly, so they can just drop me a message on LinkedIn is probably the best thing to do. I also, there's a deck that I'm very happy to share with them over LinkedIn, which has my phone number and email and everything else if they need it. But that's probably the best place to start, I would have thought.
Okay, perfect. Well, Nick, thank you very much for joining me on Scouting for Growth. Thank you for joining me again, because I know we talked a while ago just when you were in Zigo, and it's lovely to have you back with us in the industry.
Thank you so much for having me as well. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, supporting our insurtech, fintech, health tech, all those businesses in the UK and Europe wanting to grow in the United Kingdom, but also seeking help in European jurisdiction and probably beyond as well. So thank you for joining us.
UK is my next venture. Yeah. Thank you, Sabine.
My pleasure. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Scouting for Growth. Please subscribe, share with friends, and leave a 5-star rating. Your rating is so valuable. I review all of them, and my team help me adapt content to meet your needs. Also, connect with me on my preferred channels. I am a B2B growth expert, so you will find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Threads, and X as well as Blue Sky. All information available below. Until next, keep scouting for growth.